The moment the palace walls stopped whispering and started filing legal documents, everything changed. This was no longer a family disagreement buried behind velvet curtains and forced smiles. This was war, cold, calculated, and devastating. Because when Prince William, the future king himself, walked into the High Court and officially launched a legal strike against his own brother, he wasn't just defending his reputation, he was sending a message that echoed through Buckingham Palace, through Hollywood boardrooms, and straight into the collapsing empire Harry and Meghan had spent 5 years building. And suddenly, the illusion shattered. Suddenly, the carefully constructed narrative began falling apart piece by piece, exposing a financial disaster, a corporate betrayal, and a $25 million Spotify deal that insiders now describe as one of the most embarrassing executive miscalculations in modern media history. Because behind the headlines, behind the smiling Montecito photos and staged appearances, there was panic. Pure panic. Spotify executives had once believed they were securing royalty and exile authentic voices with insider access to the most secretive institution on earth. They signed the check. $25 million. A number so massive it carried expectations of explosive storytelling, raw access, and relentless output. But what they received instead was silence. Months passed, then more months. Meetings were scheduled and canceled. Production timelines slipped into oblivion. Internal teams waited for content that never came. And slowly, inside Spotify headquarters, excitement turned into confusion. Confusion turned into frustration. And frustration turned into something far worse, regret. Because the truth, buried beneath NDAs and corporate politeness, was humiliating. The deal had promised consistent podcast episodes, but insiders revealed that the output was almost non-existent. 12 episodes. 12. Over nearly 3 years. Executives began asking questions no one wanted to answer. Where was the work? Where was the urgency? Where was the professionalism? Instead, what they discovered was a production process that insiders described as chaotic, fragmented, and disturbingly artificial. Interviews Meghan was supposed to personally conduct were allegedly handled by junior staff members. Raw recordings were handed off. Her voice was added later, edited, reconstructed, manufactured into something that sounded personal but wasn't. It wasn't a conversation. It was an illusion. Inside Spotify, anger boiled over. Executives felt deceived. They had invested in authenticity but received performance. And as internal audits exposed the truth, the damage became impossible to ignore. The deal was bleeding money with nothing to justify its existence. Legal teams reviewed contracts. Accountants calculated losses. And then came the moment executives had quietly prepared for, the clawback. Spotify didn't pay the full $25 million. They couldn't justify it. They invoked underperformance clauses. They cut payments. They walked away. And just like that, the deal that was supposed to define Harry and Meghan's independence became a symbol of their failure. But what made it worse wasn't just the financial loss. It was the humiliation. Because executives didn't stay silent forever. Behind closed doors, they began talking. Privately at first. Then more openly. One former executive reportedly admitted they had seen interns produce more consistent content. Interns. The comparison alone was devastating. The couple who once commanded global attention had failed to meet even the most basic expectations of the industry they had entered so competently. And suddenly, the industry began watching differently. Agents hesitated. Producers stepped back. Partnerships grew cold. The Sussex name, once electric, began to feel radioactive. Meanwhile, back in London, something even more explosive was unfolding. Prince William had been watching everything. Every interview, every documentary, every claim, every accusation. He had remained silent, publicly calm, privately calculating. But behind palace doors, legal teams had been building something dangerous. Evidence, emails, contracts, drafts, internal communications. They were constructing a case piece by piece, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer serve the crown. And that moment arrived when Harry's memoir and media deals transformed private family pain into global profit. According to court filings, William's legal team believes those stories weren't just emotional recollections, they were strategic commodities, designed to generate money, attention, and leverage. And suddenly, the battle shifted. This wasn't emotional anymore. This was legal, institutional, ruthless. Because William wasn't asking for apologies, he wasn't asking for reconciliation, he was asking for judgment, a ruling, a permanent record that would define truth and falsehood under law. Insiders revealed the palace wasn't interested in settlements or quiet compromises. They wanted validation. They wanted vindication. They wanted the narrative control back. And as this legal storm gathered strength, the financial consequences began tightening around Harry and Meghan like a noose, because Spotify wasn't the only partner losing faith. Netflix executives had watched the Spotify collapse closely. Publishing partners grew nervous. Hollywood insiders began whispering a phrase that once seemed impossible. The Sussex brand was toxic. The same name that once guaranteed global headlines now triggered hesitation. Risk assessments replaced excitement. Legal exposure replaced opportunity. And inside Montecito, behind carefully staged public appearances, insiders revealed the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The empire wasn't expanding, it was shrinking rapidly because the reality was brutal. Their business model had depended on one resource: royal access, royal secrets, royal drama. But that resource was finite, and now, with legal action underway and corporate partners retreating, the supply was drying up. Without new revelations, without new leverage, without new access, the machinery that had generated millions began stalling, and executives across the entertainment world began asking the same devastating question: what happens when the story ends? But perhaps the most terrifying realization wasn't financial, it was personal. Because insiders revealed that as legal pressure mounted and financial uncertainty grew, cracks began forming where no one expected them. Strategic distancing, careful statements, subtle attempts to separate responsibility. And suddenly, the unity that had defined their public image began to look less certain, less unbreakable, less permanent. And as Prince William's legal offensive advanced with precision, the message became unmistakably clear. This wasn't revenge, this was correction. This was the monarchy drawing a line and refusing to let its legacy be rewritten for profit. The palace had waited patiently. They had endured the accusations. They had allowed the media storm to rage. But now they were responding, not with emotion, but with law. And in that moment, everything changed. Because the fairy tale rebellion that had once captivated the world was now facing something far more powerful than headlines or sympathy. It was facing consequences. And while the public was still trying to process the humiliation of the Spotify collapse, something even more devastating was unfolding behind closed doors in Montecito, where the carefully curated image of confidence and independence had begun to crack under the weight of reality. Because losing Spotify wasn't just losing a partner, it was losing credibility. Inside their inner circle, insiders began noticing the shift immediately. Phone calls that once came eagerly from producers now went unanswered. Invitations slowed. Meetings became tense, filled with polite smiles masking brutal hesitation. The same executives who once fought to sign them were now quietly asking lawyers how to protect themselves from further association. The $25 million disaster hadn't just damaged their finances, it had destroyed trust. And trust, once broken in Hollywood, doesn't return easily. Netflix, their biggest remaining ally, had been watching carefully. Initially, Netflix executives had defended their investment, hoping the explosive success of their first docuseries would justify the enormous financial risk they had taken. The numbers had looked promising at first. Global attention, massive viewership, headlines dominating every continent. But attention alone couldn't sustain a business model, because after the initial shock faded, the follow-up projects began collapsing one by one. Concepts were pitched, approved, and then mysteriously delayed. Scripts stalled. Production timelines stretched endlessly. Projects announced with excitement quietly disappeared without explanation. Executives grew frustrated. They weren't investing in nostalgia, they needed output. They needed consistency. They needed results. Instead, what they saw was chaos. One project after another failed to deliver meaningful engagement. Viewer retention dropped. Internal analytics exposed an uncomfortable truth: audiences weren't coming back. The curiosity had been temporary. The loyalty never materialized. And suddenly, inside Netflix boardrooms, conversations turned from optimism to containment. Executives weren't discussing expansion anymore. They were discussing exit strategies, because continuing the partnership wasn't just unprofitable, it was becoming a reputational liability. Meanwhile, the publishing world was facing its own nightmare. Harry's memoir had generated massive sales initially, but what once looked like a financial triumph was now turning into a legal landmine. With Prince William's lawsuit targeting the accuracy and intent behind those explosive claims, publishers found themselves trapped in dangerous territory. Because if the court ruled that key elements were knowingly false or maliciously exaggerated, the consequences would extend far beyond Harry himself. The publisher could face contractual violations, breach of warranty clauses could be triggered, entire future book deals could collapse instantly, and suddenly what had once been celebrated as a bold tell-all was being re-examined as a potential legal catastrophe. Inside Montecito, the pressure was suffocating. Financial projections that once promised endless expansion were now being rewritten. Revenue streams shrank, expenses remained massive, legal fees mounted relentlessly. Every lawyer consultation carried another devastating invoice. Millions drained quietly while income slowed to a trickle. And insiders revealed something far more disturbing: the realization that their financial independence had been built on expectations, not sustainability. Without constant deals, constant headlines, constant output, the entire structure began collapsing under its own weight. And as the legal threat from Prince William intensified, panic transformed into strategy. Because this wasn't just about money anymore, it was about survival. Public relations teams scrambled to reshape the narrative. Carefully staged public appearances suddenly became more frequent. Paparazzi photos captured smiles that insiders claimed were rehearsed, not genuine. Statements leaked anonymously to friendly outlets attempted to redirect attention, portraying them as victims of institutional retaliation rather than participants in their own downfall. But something had changed. The public reaction wasn't the same. Sympathy had turned into skepticism. Curiosity had turned into fatigue, because people had begun noticing the pattern. The promises were always enormous. The delivery was always underwhelming. The headlines were always dramatic. The results were always disappointing. And slowly, the mystique that once protected them evaporated completely. But the most devastating blow remained the lawsuit itself. Because Prince William wasn't just defending himself, he was dismantling the foundation of their credibility. His legal team demanded access to private communications, internal drafts, production agreements, and financial contracts. They weren't guessing. They were investigating. Every email, every revision, every negotiation was now subject to scrutiny. And insiders revealed that this process terrified everyone involved, because the truth, once exposed in court, couldn't be controlled, edited, or rewritten. And perhaps the most chilling realization of all was this: the monarchy had waited deliberately. They hadn't reacted emotionally. They hadn't lashed out publicly. They had allowed the narrative to unfold, allowed the deals to be signed, allowed the statements to be made. And only now, when the financial empire was already weakening, did they strike. Not with interviews, not with press releases, but with law. Inside palace walls, the strategy was clear. This wasn't about revenge, it was about precedent. They weren't just defending the past, they were protecting the future. Because if one royal could monetize private institutional secrets without consequence, it would weaken the entire system permanently. The lawsuit wasn't just a response, it was a warning. Meanwhile, in Hollywood, the consequences continued spreading like wildfire. Agents began quietly advising clients to distance themselves. Producers hesitated to attach their names to new proposals. Investors questioned whether any future partnership could survive the ongoing legal chaos. The Sussex brand, once seen as revolutionary, was now viewed as unpredictable, unstable, and legally dangerous. And in the center of it all stood Harry himself, facing the reality that the rebellion he had believed would secure his independence had instead left him more vulnerable than ever. Because the institutions he had challenged weren't collapsing, they were fighting back, and they had resources, patience, and power far beyond anything he had anticipated. The Spotify deal had been the beginning of the dream. The lawsuit was becoming the end of it. Because in the ruthless world of power, money, and legacy, the most dangerous mistake isn't making enemies. It's underestimating them. And now, as court dates approached, contracts disintegrated, and financial pressure mounted relentlessly, one truth became impossible to escape. The empire that had promised freedom had delivered exposure. The deals that had promised independence had created dependence. And the rebellion that had promised victory was now facing defeat. Not in headlines, but in reality. The silence from Montecito grew louder with every passing day.